Hey everybody, good morning. Welcome to this week's AT Town Hall. The group has had a conversation before the recording that this may be the second to last one for a little while. We may wrap up next week, June 8th, take a little break and then come back over the summer. So maybe we'll do a little poll and see what dates people like for the summer, sometime in July perhaps. We have a handful of people here. You can tell it's getting close to the end of the year. Our group is getting smaller every week. So that maybe wrapping this up soon is a good idea. To reminder, this is hosted from our Assistive Technology Act project. There's me. I'm the director. Hello. Good morning. Here's some of our panels. Some are here, some are not. Alyssa's here. Karen's here. Apparently the right-hand side of that picture is here. The middle and left, not so much. Just a reminder, we have the AT Chat website, atchat.info, where a lot of this information we talk about in these weekly town halls shows up. So you can always go back there to find it. We will dive into the convo. We have two big things to talk about today, but you're free to chat. You can put your camera on, you can put your mic on, whatever you want. We are about as loose a group as you're going to find, so however you want to participate, we are all for it. You can just do the chat also if you'd like. We have our general kind of jumping in point if someone has a positive story. Bruce has a question he has that he wants to get the group's input on. Bruce, if you want to do that while we're doing this, kind of share a positive story, and we'll kind of roll it all together.
I can actually share a positive story.
Awesome.
One of the teachers I work with who is pretty technologically challenged, she'd be the first one to say that. She'd probably say it more explicitly. But she was having trouble with her personal computer, and she was during our AT office hours, and she was a little reluctant, and we said, no, go ahead. And it ended up her teenage son had set up a new Wi-Fi, right. But her Mac would connect to it, but her PC wouldn't. But she didn't realize that she thought the problem was with the website. So I was able to talk her through how you diagnose whether you're actually connected to the internet or not, get her PC on it. And she sent me 2 thank yous already. So never underestimate what you can do to help someone rather than just, getting close to the screen saying, well, what do you mean you don't understand? You're not on the internet, So
that's always a nice thing, right? To remember that. So it's not all about curriculum access. Sometimes it is literally access. Sometimes that is the problem. That is very cool. Awesome. Thank you. And then what was your question for the group?
Well, this is a fairly big one. I'm interested if anyone's district is reopened or plans to do face-to-face for ESY, and if they've had any published guidelines. So let me first say that one of my districts, Tigard, has already said they were going to do face-to-face ESY, and then a number of the neighboring districts pulled out of it, and so now they're reassessing. So parents have been called. Do you want to have your kid come to school, et cetera? They've started putting together guidelines, and now it looks like they might roll it all back because they realize they don't have the ability to do it. But here's my big question, because remember, I'm a PT. So far, no one's published any guidelines that I've seen on what you do when you can't physically distance from a kid. You have to help them in the bathroom. You have to help them with feeding. You have to help them with mobility. Are those students going to be able to return to school, or are we looking at distance learning for certain subsets, even as at least small groups of kids return? So there's a bunch in there.
There is a bunch in there. And actually, Bruce, that kind of fits into our overall big kind of conversation anyway, which is about this, what does service look like going forward? I think it's really interesting that school district was making a play for face-to-face ESY. I think that's really, I have not heard a single district that I've spoken to that thinks ESY is going to be face-to-face.
The Oregon Department of Ed published, so their distance learning thing was called Distance Learning for All. And then they have this habit of, like, Friday late afternoon, when no one can talk with them, publishing their guidelines, so that
like at a 4:30 or 5 o'clock.
And so they publish beyond distance learning, and it was guidelines for summer services, and they even had diagrams of how far apart desks have to be. And I mean, it was somewhat detailed. They didn't cover the other kids, but now it looks the kids that have physical needs. But now it looks like everybody's going to roll back from that. I'm
Yeah.
still waiting to hear more.
Yeah, it is interesting. I'd be really interested to hear what kind of feedback they got, like where all that, like what people thought once they kind of processed their 4:30 on a Friday afternoon drop of news. Really interesting. And
Yeah, I'm not aware.
Marby just dropped something in the chat too, an article about students returning to school.
I'm not aware of anybody up in the New England area that's opening up for extended school year, ESY.
Yeah.
So the article I just put up is from a school district in California, and it was about students with the most significant, not necessarily physical needs, but more behaviorally oriented students with autism and Down syndrome is what they mentioned, who are having the most difficult participating in learning at home.
Okay.
So they have a photo there of what the classroom looks like and then some description about it. But it was an interesting perspective to give a window of what this might look like.
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah, to get kind of a sense, because that might also be the same kind of the same category of student who might struggle with the idea of wearing a mask and that tactile piece of that also. So that could be really interesting.
They talk about that in the article.
Okay. So what you're saying is I need to read this article. Everybody take 5 minutes.
It gives just a little glimpse of what it might be like.
Interesting.
So I do have a positive to share from Lauren and I. I don't think that Lauren's been on to share this yet, but a couple Mondays ago, we were able to get equipment, positioning and mobility equipment out to 15 of our students with the most complex physical needs. And it took an amazing amount of coordination and choreography and cleaning. But we did it one day. We were able to go to schools and pick up equipment. And with the help of facilities, we were like a little caravan and bring it to one main building. And then we had set up a schedule. So the next day, we were able to have families come every half hour on the half hour to pick up the piece of equipment for their particular student. The PTs were lined up to do virtual training that afternoon or the next day with each family. And then our school district, for the small number of families that could not come and pick up, they provided a driver and a vehicle, and we went to those students' houses and dropped things off. So that was, for those students and those families, that was a really big deal. And we are really happy that was able to finally happen in spite of how long it took. But now, not knowing when we're going back, I think it makes it even more important that we were able to do that.
Yeah. What were some of the how do I want to ask this? How I'm trying to imagine students that have significant positioning needs. And was that pickup when they came in person? Were there therapists there to point parents towards a proper positioning within this equipment? I know you said it was virtually that they followed up with their therapist, but
yeah, no, they the PTs provided video and or documentation from the vendors about the equipment and about the different points. We didn't send anything home that a student had not already used and been fitted in, so that there was no fitting necessary. It was more getting them in there correctly. No parent was going to have to make a decision about the height or the width or any of those kind of things. Those were any student who had never used equipment before. We did not send that kind of equipment home. So this was equipment that was already set up for this particular student.
Okay. That makes a lot more sense, because then that second part of that would fit into our conversation for this week.
Yeah.
A student has a need, we have to identify it and evaluate it and get them something. And what does that look like?
We also kind of some things that ruled out participation was if the family was not able to participate in video conferencing because we wanted to not only have phone contact, but the therapist needed to be able to see eyes on with the student and the family. And our district has been working really hard to support internet access and providing MiFis to families if they did not have internet. So we had to make sure some kids were able to get that equipment so that they could then participate in the equipment to home. We also were able to some families had not yet signed consent to participate in teletherapy. And so we were able to have those forms available that verbally they had said they wanted to do this, but they had not signed the paperwork. So we were able to have that paperwork available also. So when they picked up the equipment and signed for the equipment, they also signed to participate the consent in teletherapy. So we tried to get a bunch of things done at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, why not? Why not try to kill multiple birds with one stone, per se? Since you have them and you're going to share that with them, why not get them to do all that other stuff? That's interesting. And Bruce said he had the same idea, the same criteria on sending equipment home. I would think that makes sense. It's equipment that you've already evaluated the student for at some point.
Yep.
I 100% agree. And what I said in the chat is actually had conflict with a parent. I don't know if it went to the superintendent level, but it rose pretty high. But this, excuse me, her daughter had not used a gait trainer successfully. And it wasn't even something I was able to release to the staff. I had to be there whenever we tried it. And she also didn't have video, though that was secondary. But the main thing was it wasn't equipment she'd used successfully. I offered to send home an adaptive chair, which, you know, obviously is something that she had used and is much more passive. You don't have to worry about someone getting injured in it. So,
yeah, we had, when we were developing this process, Marby didn't have a chance to speak to this yet, but we had talked with the physical therapist about what the risks were. And with some of this, there were just such significant risks that we had to have pretty deep criteria for pretty detailed, you know, we need a lot of detailed information about the success of the student using it and also the ability for the family to follow through.
Yeah, this whole area, what we're talking about right now, much more potential for harm than sending a Chromebook home.
Or a communication device that maybe happened to get left behind. Like there's not going to be any damage. I mean, with the student using it, they're, you know, not using it, but using it, no.
And because of that, we had to work very closely with our school district's emergency manager, and he took what we had previously used as an equipment loan form, and he renovated it, he edited it, and then it had to go up the chain for approval through district attorneys and feedback, and it was quite a process.
Yeah, we used some justification from Resna. They had some they had like a white paper out about positioning and mobility equipment, and we were able to use some of the justification from that to show and talk about it with people who don't really know. Like the emergency management person knows a lot more about facilities, but not necessarily about student use equipment or something so specialized like positioning mobility equipment. So we were able to use that.
That was really helpful, like to educate them about the medical complications that could occur for a student, both in terms of just all their different body functions, you know, respiratory, digestive, musculoskeletal, and you're right, Lauren, that was really helpful to put that kind of information in because it helped them say yes to the idea and the process, which then helped them move along the approval and the forms and all that stuff, because they realized that it was, for these small number of kids, it was really significant to their ability to have health.
Right. It's critical. Yeah, exactly. And Bruce asked in the chat, and I'll just reiterate it out. Oh, look at that. Never mind. Bruce asked for the link, and then magically it appeared. Alyssa working the two machines at one time got you hooked up.
The more specific link is like there's a wheelchair and assistive technology users precautions for COVID, which is that second little link. But everything that's on that Resna page is really helpful, and I have used it too in similar situations. So we sent home almost all of our positioning equipment and our everything devices back in March, and we kind of went through some of that same process of, you know, we had families that said, you know what, I don't want it. Can you give me some ideas for alternate? Because like my house isn't big enough for this.
Right.
And then we had families that were like, yes, please, you know, can we have this chair, that chair, but I don't need this. So it was like a very structured process, like you guys kind of had to go through. We didn't do like this whole big distribution day. We kind of parceled it out and our PTs did a great job of making sure, then following up with those families. And I think it was actually beneficial because our families were more hands-on in terms of their use of it in following, like in teletherapy afterwards, because it was part of that session was parent training on, okay, yeah, you see how she's kind of like this, you know, let's adjust the butterfly harness so she's in the better spot. Like, so it gave us some good opportunity to help those parents walk through things, and then they found other reasons in their house that they could be in the stander or the gait trainer, like that would incorporate into their home routine, knowing school and home are very different. But
and it kind of gives us a window into the evaluation piece, that idea of you're watching a positioning device. So in my mind, if I'm supporting a team working with some kind of specific positioning device, it kind of mirrors what I expect, like evaluations at time, that I need to be kind of moving around it. And then virtually, what does that look like? And how does that work? And you're pointing people in directions to see, you know, oh, let me see the back. Now what does the front look like? Where is this in position to everything else? It becomes a lot of directing. I think it's interesting. It kind of leads itself to what we're going to talk about, this idea of how to be in the space without being in the space with the person.
Can I ask a different question then? When is it educationally focused and medically focused? What is the responsibility of the schools for something like this for those students with more complex bodies? And when is it the medical community or the visiting nurse community or the home-based physical therapy? You know, why is it all on the school?
I don't think in our case it was all on the school. I think we were looking at, okay, typically our PT or OT would provide service while they were in their stander. So to replicate some of that same, and we did have, like I said, we had parents that had a stander at home, so we didn't provide because medical had already provided. But for a family who didn't, we felt like, okay, that home environment is right now temporarily, for whoever knows how long, going to be an educational environment. So if they don't have another means to be able to physically access that right now, and not for forever, but right now, being their educational happening at home, it's kind of parallel to what we would provide for a kiddo who's on full-time hospital homebound. In my eyes, I would not necessarily, you know, throw a bunch of equipment out there, but there are things that I would provide so that they can access their education.
I wanted to.
I can speak to that a little bit from our perspective. It did. Some of this is a equity issue, that some of the students who have more access to private PT, private services, they did have equipment already at home that was personally owned, that they got through insurance. And so those families didn't need us to send equipment home that the student uses at school. Many of the students that we sent equipment home to were either very young students who are newly in the system, and those kind of personally owned devices have not been, it's in process, but they're not at their house yet. Or they're kids who maybe don't have insurance, don't have private therapy services. And so that's, you know, we're going to be the people that are going to meet that need. And for some of those kids I think that their medical health needs has to be met before their education. You know, they have to have that in place so that then we can meet their educational needs, because they're not available for learning if they can't do these other things.
Yeah.
You're just doing the right thing.
Yeah.
We're doing what we can.
Exactly. Bruce, did you want to add something?
Well, if at least for me, I mean, those of us that have been doing this for a while have seen the medical versus educational thing get played out to death. But if for me, if I have a student using a piece of equipment at school, it's because there's an educational benefit to it. I'm not looking at a student using a standard to improve bone density or bowel bladder function or any of the medical. They're in it because maybe that's the best way for them to access a piece of technology or to offset the detrimental effects of sitting for a prolonged period, which they have to be in school. You know, so I think about for adaptive seating, for standards, for gait trainers, there's an educational component to them. However, a lot of the equipment's not going to be practical at home. And I have families whose standards are basically places they put boxes on, that they own equipment but don't use it. The amount of staff it takes to get a larger student in and out of a piece of equipment, and then having sufficient space to use a piece of mobility equipment often makes it more of a barrier. And Mike, I think early on when you started doing these, I think some of the East Coast folks that had been sending equipment home were giving feedback, if I'm remembering right, about how some of the families just found it more of a burden than a help. And that was a cautionary tale for me.
Yeah, I think well, what does it do? It brings us back to the tasks at hand. What are the tasks that student needs to complete, and what do they need in order to do that? And you know, are there things we can send home? And I know you mentioned the idea of your one student who hadn't been effective or safe in a gait trainer yet, and you offered an alternate positioning chair to give some adequate positioning. And is that something? Sorry.
Okay.
Is that something that we can do instead? You know, but it goes back to the tasks. It's remembering what it is that we're trying to do here, and providing an opportunity for that student to be safe and secure in order to complete their educational tasks. Really interesting. It lends itself nicely to this part of our conversation, which is what we did last week. This idea of what now? It's not quite ESY what's now, because that's like next week or for some of us, but it's what happens in the fall, and what does that look like as far as delivering AT services, and how are we going to do that? This is not the person who has things already. Isn't that magical? My doors just close randomly to my office. No, it's people rolling into the house. But instead, it's not kind of where we were at to get students to a certain level where they were when we were in the classroom, but instead it's identifying new needs or but changing needs and meeting them. And how do we do that in what we would typically call our AT assessment / evaluation process? And how do we do that going forward in one of these three? And I give you the screenshot of Barbara's question to Quiet because it came on the weekend before we were going to talk about this, and it was good timing for this. Barbara mentions the three possibilities for what school might look like: a face-to-face traditional, an all virtual, or somewhere in the middle. And so if that's the case, if we're going to be in any one of those three environments come the fall, how do we go about providing effective quality services? Assessments, training, delivery of product. She even mentions purchasing, follow-up, and maintenance. Just the whole gamut. It's the implementation. How do we do this? So that was just a big intro to just say, I don't know, what does somebody think? Start the convo. I'm watching Karen work through it.
I'm going to mention just something that is more of the medical end of this. My brother-in-law lives and works in Qatar, and he's an architect, and his office requires him to get a COVID test twice a week He can't enter the office building or many of the buildings he goes to unless he can show proof that he's been tested and they have pretty robust contact tracing. I saw an article on California, the superintendent of one of the districts, I think second largest district, and he said that they're not, he said the community needs to be the health, how did he put it? It's not the schools that are responsible for testing and contact tracing. So that needs to be in place. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is part of return to school going to be that students are tested, that staff are tested, that staff that have risk factors for COVID cannot do face-to-face. So it's kind of the foundational stuff.
Yeah. Everything's going to build on that. You're right. And so I think that's the first level of questions.
But I wonder, for some of our students with less significant special needs, if we can't be more creative in terms of doing things online. One of my concerns is if we're wearing masks, how does a student then, will they be able to understand us clearly through the mask? What kind of barriers does wearing a mask present in a testing environment? Will the student, students who have hearing impairments, for example, or even, students with attentional issues, what kind of barriers does even just wearing a mask in providing service delivery create? I think that something as basic as that needs to be considered. And you don't have that barrier when you're working online.
Right.
You've got other different barriers.
Exactly. Yeah, your barriers are different. Yeah.
That's exactly the question that I had. The last 3 IEPs that I attended last week, every single family asked about that question in particular. Like, if my student has a hearing impairment, or if my student has, is receiving speech, and you're covered like this, right. Or, and you, in our state, you have to have a mask. You can't just have a shield as it's written, and so what does that mean? And they're really concerned about that, particularly in terms of speech and language therapy services, as well as like all the teachers. They're saying, is every teacher going to have to have a mask and have their face covered so you can only see their eyes? And then what does that mean? If it's like this, then what does that mean for all students? And is that sustainable for a teacher for 7 or 8 hours a day to wear a mask and be teaching and projecting her voice? And so I think there's a lot of questions about the face coverings that people have to wear to be safe and how that works in schools.
Do they really say you can't wear, you cannot use a face shield?
I don't know that you cannot use a face shield, but right now, because the mask is more tight-fitting against the face, they've just said the face mask, but they haven't said a shield. I don't think there's any...
Because a face shield will certainly help. Then there's also the face masks where you've got a clear place for the mouth so you can see the mouth. But the face shield seems to take care of that issue. So I hope that they don't take away that as an option.
There's an organization in our community that's called the ARC. It used to be Association for Retarded Citizens. They don't use that name anymore, but they published something the other day about accommodations for people with disabilities. And actually, I'm going to put that in the chat because they actually included a link to creating small cards so that if you're a person with a disability and you cannot wear a mask, you can kind of like under ADA, you can self-disclose why you can or cannot do that and what accommodations you need to ask for to meet the, to get what you need. So I'm going to put that in the chat right now because I thought that was pretty interesting information and a perspective.
Yeah, it is.
Barbie and I also talked with our educational audiologist last week, and we were talking about, because the amplification systems that students have, the teacher wears like a microphone or a touchscreen microphone, and the hygienic or less than hygienic way, if you're sharing that expensive, $800 microphone, we had them sharing the microphone as the student would move throughout the day. But now, given this current situation, what will we do to change how, to make that more hygienic? So they were talking about how you can actually have the microphone, but it doesn't have to be close to your face, and then it would connect to a headset microphone that we would get for each individual. And we had talked about also the masks with the window, and how it fogs up. Actually, the material isn't breathable, and so it fogs up. And so the educational audiologist was saying, well, that's another barrier, and that's also uncomfortable. So
she was talking actually about more shield usage,
the shield,
rather than mask.
Yeah. So, and we were talking about too with the shield, if the microphone was much lower and not getting breathed on, could it still transmit the sound underneath the shield in an okay manner to still be used so the student would have access? So we're being really flexible and having to adapt all the time, because these are things that are going to come up in practice that we've never dealt with before. And certainly like the old way of doing things, we need people to bring about their questions so that we can reconsider. And the old way of doing things is not how we can always do things.
Yeah. Last week I shared a link, and I feel dumb that I took it out, so I'll just attack myself. But there was a superintendent here in New Jersey who posted a working document from a kind of an open letter from him as a superintendent to our governor. And it was 91 questions that we need to answer before we can go back to school. And it was a really powerful list. It had nothing to do with assistive technology, but it had everything to do with what we do as we go in and out of schools. And it was really powerful. I will find the link once somebody else starts talking. I'll dig the link up and I'll put it in the chat.
My daughter works at a Montessori preschool, and they opened up today.
Wow.
And she had so many worries and concerns. So she lives in Rhode Island. And so we're looking forward to talking to her tonight to see how she survived. And she's got 3, 4, and 5-year-olds in her class, and how that was all going to work. I can't even imagine.
What did they put in place before she started today? Like, what did she say? Like the steps that were in place just right away?
Well, they have to clean constantly. So she's, and they limited how many students that there are. There's 10 students. It's a private Montessori preschool, but there were a lot of stipulations that they had to follow. And I honestly don't know how they are going to do it effectively. There's no way you can keep 3, 4, and 5-year-old social distancing.
No.
It just doesn't work.
It just doesn't.
Not touching their face and their nose and their mouth and all of that.
And then touching you and sure. Exactly.
Mike, in those 91 questions, what they, if they asked, and I'm sure they probably did, about like itinerant staff like us that go to multiple schools.
It was in there somewhere. I did see it. Yeah. Right. Because that's the whole idea, right? One of the things and I had heard other people talking about this too, the idea that if they went back to some kind of modified face-to-face in schools, students would stay in one room and just staff would rotate so that it kept the people moving to a minimum. And don't worry, that's kind of interesting. Doesn't help us as itinerant staff because we're everywhere anyway.
That's exactly right. And you have to think about those. I had one person say we were intermittent, which I like.
Oh, I like that too.
But yeah, so what do we, if we're using PPE, do we change between each building? Are we, because we don't want to be the vector that carries it from, the idea is to try to contain the kids and the teachers in a small group so you can lessen the chance of an infection spreading.
Right.
But those of us that are moving around, an average day I may be in 6 to 8 different schools.
Right. And then multiple places within each of those 6 or 8 schools. Right. I mean, I can think back to days in a district where I was in every classroom in the entire school. Mm-hmm. I just can picture that days. And so, what does that do as you move through your day providing service? I put the link in the chat box for the questions sheet. It was bit.ly/91 questions. And it was a working document. He didn't say it was an end. It was just the beginning. And to imagine that these were the 91 questions on the top of his brain when he put it together is very concerning. That, you know, I'm sure it's much larger now. Yeah, and Mickey says every class in multiple schools. Yeah, I mean, that could happen. And so if we think about that, if schools go back and then they open and they put plans in place for PPE and the way you can move through a school, if you're employed by the district, I guess that's okay because you'll be covered from that. What if you're an independent consultant? I guess that means you have to be completely stocked with your own PPE to move through.
Well, I'm an independent contractor, so that is one of the questions on my list too. And we have a PT clinic which we closed down. My wife works out of, and we're trying to make decisions about reopening. And the PPE is incredibly expensive unless you buy in large quantities.
Right. Yeah. So how does that work?
I just went through a training with I just got a PPE box. They sent us all a box of stuff to make sure we have disposable gloves, disposable face mask, Kavi wipes, a face shield, with a bunch of rules about donning and doffing things and not recontaminating, and also rethinking. I'm just thinking about related services. I'm thinking about my bag of stuff I bring everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
That it can't really happen, and being really thoughtful. I'm like, I'm going to bring this in and I need to wash it before I put it back into anything. And it's so many different pieces to be thinking about, because I don't want to beat patient zero and just bring it to like the 4 or 5 different places.
Exactly.
Whether it's classrooms or schools or towns in a day.
Yeah. And then the other thing from the school's perspective, will they allow independent consultants to come in that aren't under their umbrella anymore?
It's funny, it's like I got the directive, like, okay, you can start going to people's homes now. And I'm thinking, no one is letting me in their home right now.
Yeah. No offense, Jen. I would not let you in my house. No offense.
I don't even have my family in my house yet. But as some states are.
Yeah.
So like, I'm not a rush for that, because I'm also realizing, there are things I can do online in this group, and just incredibly creative on how we can do that. I'm like, you know what? I feel like my new normal is, that if we can do it online, we're doing it online. And there's going to be maybe specific things I need to get there. And then I'm going to make sure I have disposable PPE. I'm gonna have to purchase some of my own face masks with the opening to be seen. And apparently there are some stuff you can put on your glasses and your little face mask so it doesn't fog so much. I forgot. That was a trick I learned somewhere. I'll look it up.
Yeah, it never works on my glasses, but yeah. So, dish soap and water. It's supposed to keep it from fogging up.
I put a tape or bandage on the mask upper level here, and just seal that top, and it also keeps it from sliding down. But that stops the fog. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's great. So think about putting Dawn on your glasses or something. It will stop it from fogging up. Clean them with Dawn soap.
So one of the things I'm thinking about in terms of, because there's so much for those of us who are independent consultants or even itinerant going from building to building, maybe AT evaluations will be easier to do online when there is a teacher on the other end who can help supervise what it looks like. It seems like that could potentially be easier than manufacturing all, the taking the student out of the class. I mean, just logistically managing everything. So I'm wondering if maybe that would be the alternative for those of us who have to do assessments.
I think you're right, Karen, because I think there's many schools I go into where there's been some capacity built with some of the staff to be a really good number 2 to an eval, but they don't feel comfortable being the number 1. But if they work in the district, that might be something that they're going to be allowed in the building. They're going to be following the criteria, and then maybe we could do this remotely. Some of it.
Well, maybe that would be a starting place. Let's identify what can we do when it comes to an AT assessment? What can we do remotely? What does require us to be hands-on with a student?
That's a perfect segue to what's probably on Mike's next slide, maybe.
There it is.
There you go.
Absolutely. Let's talk.
So what I did was I made a collaborative Google Doc. The link is open so anyone can go in and edit it. It had a really long name because I got really uncreative. It was late at night, I think. Calm down, pup. And so what I tried to do was kind of gather some of that. So there's both a collaborative Google Doc, and then in the Google Doc, you'll see there's a Wakelet link. It's also now linked on the AT chat website under distance learning supports. I was doing that while we were talking today. And what I tried to do was start exactly what you were talking about, Karen. So I went with two tools that I know. I thought about, Denise DeCoste's written productivity profile, because I have done one of those via teletherapy practice. And then the Self-4, which is a language assessment, is also has a standardization from the publisher for telepractice. They've done a study that shows it has the same reliability and validity as in face-to-face. So I started to try to think, okay, how do we gather, what would we normally do? Mm-hmm. How could we administer it in telepractice? And the link was just like if nobody knew about that certain test, here's a link to the assessment. And there are a couple of other things in there that I started thinking, okay, specifically for AAC support, Mike, like if you scroll down, everybody's probably in the document, but so there's stuff specific to AAC support for like AT or access, which I think like that's more our kiddos with high incidence disabilities support. And then starting to think about, okay, what other guidance do we have? So the APA has put out information like these core 6 principles, which are below where Mike is, I think. About what's important as you're thinking about teleassessment. And if the APA is guiding me, I feel like that's a pretty good, solid institution in terms of like what principles do we not want to, because very little of our assessments are standardized, let's be honest. But how can we make sure that we're still kind of following some of these same principles in terms of the data quality? Do we need to substitute a test task, and how does that alter the test? I'm not as worried about test security because AT, that's not really so much a thing, but I think just having that information. So ASHA, everybody else does say that you cannot record test administrations. So I think that's important, because I know sometimes the tendency is, oh, well, let's record this telepractice session so I can go back and review it. And the guidance right now from both ASHA and APA is that recording of that is prohibited. And then I think I've just started to try to gather, as we were talking today, questions that were posed, and then the links that were shared is right below that. But it is absolutely a working document, and I know that there are assessment tools that I use every once in a while that other people use very frequently. I haven't put any of my real like OT-PT kind of AT-ish assessments that I use from that end of my world. But I think trying to give us an idea of, is there guidance from the publisher? And if not, what would be some good solid recommendations in terms of how could we do this assessment, whether it's with, that parent as the supporter, or as, and I've done that. I mean, I mailed for an OT assessment, I mailed a VMI to a parent, had them leave it sealed until we were in the session. They opened it while we were on camera, like that whole process. And so it's possible. It's absolutely possible. And I think being able to, like, whoever's adding the PAR right now, I've done a UPAR online with them, and so I would absolutely do the UPAR if we had an option. It's not always an option, and I've done the PAR, but it's a painful hour plus versus the UPAR.
Yeah.
The UPAR is just so expensive, though.
It is. It's incredibly expensive. We're trying to work on potentially our Florida project paying for a statewide allowance of it.
Oh, that would be great.
When we think about from a data perspective, that's the sell I'm making. Like, okay, you as a state are going to have amazing data on the amount of accommodations and the reading levels of students And I'm sure it could be a way better deal if we're talking about a whole state. So cross my fingers
This
that
is
happens.
amazing. This is fantastic.
Yeah, this is awesome.
Thank you so much for all the work that is represented here.
So, and hopefully this can just continue to grow, because I know, like, when I was thinking about access supports, I already have these like little mini switch kits that I kind of grab when I know I'm going to do an assessment for a kiddo who uses switches. And it maybe is something that I just send to the classroom or the home and say, like, okay, we're going to try these out. You get the little one that's got the tiny little button, and let's plug that in and put it here. You know, we're going to have to be creative, especially because most likely my kiddos that are switch users are kiddos that are also going to be in that very high susceptible, you know, from a, you know, a possible exposure. So they're going to be the last kids I can go and be hands-on with. And obviously they're the toughest kids in my book.
Well, AbleNet I'm sorry, Elisa. Like,
go ahead.
AbleNet, and I've just started using this for higher ed type classes. They're not letting you just pick 5 tools you want and you can have them shipped. So like requesting different switches or different internet interfaces from them and having them nice and safely and disinfected shipped to the family, and then the family just puts the return label might be a way to start going. They're going to have to up their amount of switches they have available to transfer around though.
Right.
Is that their like My Way program? I know they have one thing for purchase and then one thing for trial, but I'm not.
This is like, I used to be able to like get a kit and say, okay, I want the kit. And they told me just in March, like, we're not doing kits anymore. Actually, something Mike and I were working on.
Right.
We're like, oh, wow, we can't get the kits, but we could have each team pick the 5 tools that they wanted to look at. And then AbleNet shipped them in a box, all clean, could try them out, and then return label, UPS picks it up and sends it right back.
Okay, I'll go find the link, because I know Mary, who's our representative, who's most people's representative, Mary had talked about it with me. And then at the time, I just wasn't, you know, thinking that direction because I was, I don't know, trying to figure out everything else that went along with COVID.
But it's something, it goes back to something, Alyssa, we said last week when we started talking about this. It's going to require that. Gone, I think, are our days of just randomly pulling stuff out of a bag to start working on it. And we're going to have to be a little more thoughtful in putting those things together, tagging them, explaining what they are, so we're able to dictate virtually to someone, this is the tool I'm talking about. This is the thing we should try right now. Because I know, and maybe that's just me, but I know I'm notorious for just a big giant bag of stuff. Yeah. And I just start pulling things out. And, you know, I don't think we're going to be able to do that anymore. And then the flip side of it, what are the procedures we put in place for ourselves for when those things come back? To clean and sterilize and protect ourselves from those things, just as much as we're protecting the people we're sending it to, I think is going to be a key. You know, and sending it early enough so people feel comfortable. I know there's still people who they'll get something and they'll let it sit for a day or two before they open it. That's fine. But we need to plan for that. And then we'll need to plan accordingly of not backing things up right next to each other, one right after another. We're going to need some lead time.
Well, and I think that's going to be true for, like, I was trying to think through what does a typical OT or PT schedule look like?
Right.
I know in my head we allocate based on this amount of treatment sessions a day, but I can't do that anymore because there's going to need to be these gaps in between every treatment session for us to sanitize and swap out and move all that stuff. So it's going to, in my mind, it's going to reduce the number of treatment sessions I can expect from an itinerant therapist in a day, which then, like, the kids still have to be seen. So does that mean more therapists?
Right. Yeah. How does that work? And then if we're talking AT evals and trials, if I have only 2 kits, whatever this kit is, I can't do any more trials than that at any given time because I can't send it to somebody else's house. You know, I have switches floating around all over my house, but I only have so many.
Right.
And then even, you know, and like the program that Jen mentioned from AbleNet, at some point they're going to say, oh, we don't have any more switches. All our switches are out in these little kits. You You know,
right. And I've already told Bill Bingo he better be ready to 3D print a whole crap load of switches.
I'm seriously, I'm convinced I'm going to head back to my office that's closed at some point soon and gather up my 3D printer so I can start printing some stuff to send to people.
So the one that I use the most often is a teardrop switch. That's the best way I can describe it. It's a lot like, because it's got a very flat surface, so the kid doesn't have to reach up and over in order to attack it. It's very streamlined.
Yeah.
So being able to like just very quickly, so I use a lot of the teardrops, but I still have people who want other switches. And I've switched to probably 50% 3D switches, 3D printed switches, and we are buying some things, but I'm probably at about 50%.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd like to get us to a point where we're at that too. Just for the value of it, to get it to people. And the other thing I would say to people is, normally I would say right away, go to your AT Act and borrow things from them. But I think a large percentage of them have stopped loaning things. I know ours has. We have not planned to restart that anytime soon either.
That's where we are too in Florida. And so we were lucky enough where we got some individual requests for what do you want to spend money on, and my AT support, my AC person and I were like, everything we can toss out, we will, because hopefully then we have to do very little borrowing of the state lending library, because I think it's only going to increase wait times. Not only because there'll be more people asking for it, but and I think stuff is starting to go out, but I just know then there's still going to be it's not like they can turn it around as quickly as they used to get it right back out. So there's going to be more wait periods.
Yeah. And Catherine said in the chat that they're loaning in Pennsylvania. So there you go. So people are starting to loan things and get their processes back up and running. So that's positive. It's still going to, I feel like our time frame is just been stretched for this whole process, though. I think it's going to look very different. And there will be some parts that we'll be able to do remotely, but I think we're going to need some support for some of the others.
This is Catherine. In Pennsylvania, most of what we're loaning at this point, I've got to say, is iPad based.
Okay.
So when this whole situation cropped up, we were able to obtain some funds that we used to get like 100 iPads. And we're literally cleaning them, sanitizing them in our individual houses, and then mailing them out via UPS or USPS. And so it's not a long-term solution, but at least we have been able to establish a loan program again and get stuff into people's hands, but a limited range of stuff.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, that's good to hear, Catherine. We're still in the planning phase of trying to re-get things back up and running, and also to figure out a way to get the stuff that's out in the community back. I mean, we had said to people, if you have something of ours, great, hold on to it. And at some point we will ask for it back. And we're probably going to start that very soon to start the process rolling a little bit again. Good question. Good comment. Thanks. Anybody else? Any other thoughts? We're getting close to the top of the hour.
I just have a general question. I got a request to teach a team of teachers how to use breakout rooms in Google Meet, which seems really labor intensive compared to Zoom, which is so easy. Has anyone tried doing breakout rooms in Google Meet?
We do them. I've done them about twice, and essentially what I ended up doing was setting up sessions that ran almost concurrently on my Google Calendar, and then when it was time to go break out, once they're set up, it's pretty easy. Like when it was time to break out, I would say, in the chat box and in a separate Google Doc, I shared with them group one, like I'd title it whatever it was, so it was clear, like they weren't just clicking on a random link, and then they jump into that one, and then I tell them, okay, when time is up, go back to meet.google.com and click back into our original meeting or whatever the case may be.
Well, do you see teachers, so they want me to show this as an option where I would just say, can I just model Zoom for them? But they expect their teachers to follow through with this? Did you find that teachers were creating Google Meet breakout rooms?
I had two middle school teachers that did do it. They were teaching like regular ed, history, social studies, something. and they did utilize it. So, I mean, just being able to I kind of had a Google Doc meeting, and it depends on what platform they're using for their students too. Yeah, like Jennifer's saying, with Google Classroom, they could easily, for their students, drop in the links in a Google Classroom so that then they say, okay, when it's time for our session, go click the right link in Google Classroom. We just used a Google Doc in the chat because it was just, we weren't using a Google Classroom platform or a Schoology or anything like that. We were just, that was our meeting conversation. So it's possible. And there are some places like where I'm at that Zoom is never going to be the #1 tool. It's never going to be super allowed. So being able to find that workaround has helped.
Yeah, and that's definitely not as easy as Zoom. And also, you're relying on people to bring themselves back at some point.
Right.
Or you have to go and jump back into every breakout room and say, hey, come on back. Whereas in Zoom, you hit the button and what happens? Boom, they're all back.
Yeah, I know. And I suspect, as this continues, I would not be surprised if we see some of those elements creeping into Google Meet. We've already seen some merging of some things that, Zoom has that Google Meet didn't. I suspect we're going to see some of those. I know that it's one of those gigantic wish lists from anybody who doesn't use Zoom for the regular portion of their work is to have access to that for sure.
Yeah, I agree. I think you are going to see that. They're all going to start to blend what they add to theirs, and it's going to be all kind of about the same. Yeah, agreed. Well, there you go. Great. Karen, when you make your plan for them, let us all know so you can share it with us.
I'm doing it on Wednesday.
All right.
So anyway, Mike, can you stay on afterwards, or should we just have another? I just want to talk to you about 2 things.
Sure, we can stay on. And okay. I'm the controller of the meeting, so I can boot everybody else, so we can have our own private discussion. Any last comments before we go? It is now 1:00 Eastern.
No, I would say just keep adding to things that are there. As I keep finding things, I'll drop them either in the Google Doc or in the Wakelet or both places. But hopefully by the time we're having to really do this for real in the fall, we've got a good, robust tool of what could we possibly use.
Yeah. For sure, and I think we'll revisit this on Wednesday on IT Chat. We'll throw it out there maybe as part of that as well.
Okay.
All right, everybody.
Thanks, Elisa.
Cool.
You're welcome.
Everybody.
Thank you so much.
Have a good week.
Bye. Thank
everybody.
you.
Good to see you
guys.
guys.
Bye, everyone.
I'll email you later, Mike. Hi, Karen.